Okay, so we're going to be looking today at the book of Haggai. We are in, historically speaking, we are about 70 years or more after Zephaniah, certainly 70 years after the Babylonian captivity. Okay? And I'm going to assume a little bit that you know some of the history here, okay? But we'll sort of touch base on what things are going on. The important thing, I think, for Haggai is that, like a lot of these prophets, we give some context to what was going on during his day. And so as we look at that, I want us to look at two places. Number one, first thing, I want us to look at Daniel chapter 9, okay? And then I want to take a look at the book of Ezra. And that'll help sort of set the stage for what we're doing here. Daniel chapter 9 is one of the, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just a rather remarkable prayer from a guy who it doesn't seem like needed to even pray this prayer. It was a prayer that Daniel prayed of repentance. And he's somewhat speaking on behalf of all of Israel here. Okay? We know Daniel, we know who he was. He's considered probably the last of the major prophets. But he was obviously sent into captivity. He was a man that was well revered even by the non-Christian world, or I should say the non-Jewish world he was living in. He had a lot of visions of what was going to go on. But in chapter 9, he takes this bold step to speak on behalf of Israel. And basically, in all that prayer, he says, it was our own fault. Take a look at Daniel chapter 9. Let's take a look and read through parts of this. Maybe even the whole thing. Can I get somebody to read in Daniel chapter 9, verses 4 through 10? And we'll at least start there, see if we want to pursue that any further. Daniel 9, 4 through 10.
I pray to the Lord my God and confess, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with all who love him and obey his commands. We have sinned and done wrong. We have been wicked and have been rebelled. We have turned away from your commands and your laws. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, and to all the people of the land. Lord, you are righteous, but this day we are covered with shame. The men of Judah, the people of Jerusalem, and all Israel, both near and far, in all the countries where you have scattered us because of our unfaithfulness to you. O Lord, we and our kings, our princes, and our fathers are covered with shame, because we have sinned against you. The Lord our God is merciful and forgiving, even though we have rebelled against him. We have not obeyed the Lord our God, or kept the laws he gave us through his servants, the prophets.
And he goes on, all Israel has broken your law and turned away, refusing to obey you. He goes on to talk about the fact that in the law of Moses, there was a curse placed upon them. Should you decide that you're not going to obey God, a lot of things are going to happen to you as a result of that disobedience. And so Daniel recognizes that what was in the law has now been fulfilled because of their behavior. And to me, this is a rather remarkable, if not profound, admission by a guy who, for all intents and purposes, seemed like the guy who doesn't need to pray this prayer. But maybe it's that kind of person who needs to be able to speak for all of Israel. And he does so with a tremendous amount of humility here, doesn't he? He says, we, all of Israel, have turned away from you. Okay? He'll go on by the time you get to verse 15. Now, Lord our God, who brought your people out of the land of Egypt with a strong hand and made your name renowned as it is this day, we have sinned. we've acted wickedly. He sort of keeps repeating it. But in this case, he addresses God as the God who had already redeemed them from slavery. Okay? Which is not uncommon in what some of the prophets and people like Samuel would have done for Israel. They sort of give a little history lesson. Sort of remind them where they came from. They remind them of their story, of just what their experiences have been with God. And in this case, Daniel is bringing out those same things. He's talking about those things, reminding them who they are, but he's also reminding them, but you guys haven't listened. We haven't listened, excuse me. That's the way Daniel phrases this, doesn't he? And then he goes on in verse 17 and following, therefore, our God, hear the prayer and the petitions of your servant. Make your face shine on your desolate sanctuary for the Lord's sake. Listen closely, my God, and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations and the city that bears your name. For we are not presenting our petitions before you based on our righteous acts, but based on your abundant compassion. Lord, hear. Lord, forgive. Lord, listen and act. My God, for your own sake, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name. I think there's a eloquence about this prayer. And if you compare this prayer with some of what we often call the penitential psalms, you'll see some clear comparisons, some clear recognitions that, we just depend on your mercy. And even in the Old Testament here, they depended on God's compassion and what we now call grace. That wasn't a foreign concept to them. And you listen to what Daniel says here. He says, basically, this isn't because of our own righteous acts that we're asking. Now, if that's not grace, I don't know what is. See? But there's still this recognition that that's the God that they serve. And I just love this I love it for Daniel saying this prayer. Okay? And it's inspiring to hear somebody just come up with the kind of humility that is needed in the face of one's sin. So that's part of the context. Now this is probably written before we get to the book of Haggai. I don't know the date on Daniel chapter 9 exactly, but I don't know whether Daniel was even alive to see those the Israelites come back to Jerusalem. But this prayer happens seems to me pretty quickly after the Babylonian captivity. All right, it's right in that time frame, right after that at some point. He says, yep, we blew it. It's all our fault. So that's part of the context we're going to get to. Now, if you would, let's turn to the book of Ezra. That's back among the history books. And by the time we get to Ezra, we have a situation where Israel is starting to come back. Okay? Nehemiah would be near the end. Ezra just before Nehemiah, right after 2nd Chronicles is where you find Ezra. Okay? And we won't go into all the detail here on all of this. But I just want to mention to you a couple of things here about the context in which we find the prophet Haggai. And by the way, the prophet Zechariah. Haggai and Zechariah are kind of two of the same things. They're working in the same situation, okay? They're sort of, I don't know, bosom buddies. I don't know if you want to call it that, but they work together. And when we get to Zechariah, which by the way is next week, Zechariah, I find Zechariah one of the more mysterious books to try to understand, certain parts of it. I see Ron Deffenbaugh shaking his head, so I'm not alone here. There are just some things that Zechariah says that are just puzzling to me, okay? There's certainly some meaningful things in there, and we'll get to some of that when we see that. So just be aware that Hezekiah and Zechariah, they're both working together. They're both, I don't know how friendly they were with each other, but we'll see them working together. Now in Ezra, chapters 4 through 6, Ezra is about the rebuilding of the temple. And that's basically what we have in Haggai. Haggai is trying to encourage that. He's trying to get that done. Okay? He's trying to get the people to see this is what needs to happen. God has brought you back for this purpose. Okay? And in chapters 4 through 6, let me just see how much historical knowledge you do have here. So let me ask the group, how much of what's going on in Ezra are you aware of? Are you familiar with? Anybody? Give me one thing you're familiar with in Ezra.
Well, he stands up and reads the law.
He reads the law. That's a little bit later on after the, I think that's when they dedicate the temple, isn't it, Ron? Yeah, okay. Let me ask you this. Are you aware that when Israel comes back and starts rebuilding the temple, how do all the people that are around Jerusalem feel about this? I see a couple of heads going like this. What's going on there? Anybody? Yeah, they try to stop them. What did they do? They try to get some of the officials involved. They send letters back to the people in charge and say, this is a rebellious group. You don't want them establishing themselves in any way, shape, or form. And so they send a letter back and it stops. Okay. What happens then? Well, the people of Israel themselves say, wait a minute. Let's kind of get this back on track. And in chapter 5 and verse 1, actually begin in chapter 4, verse 24. Now the construction of God's house in Jerusalem had stopped and remained at a standstill until the 2nd year of the reign of King Darius of Persia. But when the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Edom, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, began to build God's house in Jerusalem. The prophets of God were with them and helping them. Okay, so there's the first time we read about Haggai. And he's also mentioned in chapter 6 and verse 14. The Jewish elders continued successfully with the building under the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. Now, between chapter 5, verse 1 and chapter 6, verse 14, another round of letters happened. And the people back in power looked up some information. They looked up in their files, whatever kind of filing system that they would have had. Obviously not computers. They didn't have this based in the cloud somewhere. But the fact is they kept records. And the records showed that this was something that had been allowed by a previous administration. And then they send this information back to the people around Jerusalem. They say, you should let these people go. They need to do this. They've been given permission to do this. Okay. It's important for us, I think, to understand the context here. There's some opposition. All right? Things aren't going